My name is John DeLynn. That's my wife, Margie. She's standing there in the back.
Hi, Margie.
I'm a PhD student at Utah State University. I study under Dr. Renee Gallagher, who's here.
Yay.
She was one of the PIs, she's one of the principal investigators on this study, along with a former professor of mine named Bill Bradshaw from Brigham Young University.
That's awesome.
He's sort of interesting because he is he's an active believing member of the church. He's a former mission president. He's a former member of the state presidency. And he is also a very strong ally and advocate for LGBT issues. And he's a biologist, so he knows quite a bit about the biology of same-sex attraction. And so, you know, the three of us plus another graduate student of Renee's named Katie decided that we were going to put together a survey to learn more about the same-sex attracted experience within Mormonism. Now, I'll just start by saying that that term same-sex attraction is a little bit controversial in Mormonism and maybe in certain areas outside of it. Do any of you have sort of a negative connotation associated with the word same-sex attraction? I want you to know that we're aware of that. It's actually a commonly, as I understand it, a commonly accepted term within the field of LGBT research, because it's a way to describe sort of everybody who experiences these attractions. So we don't mean it in an attempt to deny someone's identity, how they choose to self-identify. We're using it to describe a broad population of people that we wanted to study. So I just wanted to maybe start with that disclaimer. So in the survey, what we wanted to do was to survey people who have a Mormon background, either former Mormons or current Mormons, and who've experienced same-sex attraction. Those are really the only two criteria, other than they had to be 18 years of age or older. And we just wanted to find out, most importantly, what their experiences were. We asked them questions along a few dimensions. So we asked them a bunch of demographic information, which I'm about to show you. We asked them a little bit about their sexual history, not in terms of their behavior, but in terms of when they started first feeling same-sex attraction, when they started self-identifying, when they came out, you know, things of that nature. Then we asked them a whole series of psychosocial questions about their health, their quality of life, their well-being, depression, anxiety, self-esteem, things like that. Then we went into a big long section about had they made attempts to change their sexual orientation or cope with it, and if so, through what means. And we're going to talk about that. And then the final section of the survey was about what's been their religious experience. Do they still believe? Do they not believe? Do they still attend church? Do they not attend church? How has it affected their religiosity? I think if I had to pick my biggest motivation, and probably Bill's as well, and Renee can speak for herself, even though this term, you know, sexual orientation change efforts is how it's described in the psychology literature, or SOCE. Even though sexual orientation change efforts, at least within, you know, the licensed mental health field, have been sort of summarily condemned. So in other words, the Psychological Association, the Marriage and Family Therapists, the social workers, the American Medical Association, you know, I think even the UN, pretty much everybody has said in one way or another that that they don't support and feel like sexual orientation change efforts within, you know, a licensed mental health specialist sort of scenario are very risky and potentially damaging, and definitely not effective for most of the people who participate in them. And so that question, at least amongst the professionals, has sort of already been answered. But within Mormonism, it turns out that because people believe so strongly in what they've been taught, and they have very deep spiritual and religious points of view, which we all want to respect here, and many of us here are still members of the church or believers in one shade or another. Because of those deeply held beliefs, and because of the church's position on same-sex attraction, people still sometimes desperately want to change, or they receive a lot of pressure from friends and family or church leaders
Why?
to attempt to
Why would
change.
they actually want to change?
What's that?
Why would they necessarily want to change?
Why would anybody want to change?
Why would they necessarily
If a church
if
if a church condemns, for example, same-sex
the church
behavior,
also says they strive on peace and concurrency.
That's right.
Happiness in life.
So if a church has as a moral foundation that same-sex sexual activity is a sin or is immoral, then that sort of creates the dilemma. And
there's no dilemma to me. I think peace is peace.
right. Yeah. So everybody's going to have their own spiritual religious beliefs, but what we found is that a lot of Mormons or LDS people, either historically or even presently, are still attempting to change their sexual orientation in one way or another, in spite of all the statements by these mental health associations. And so, in the past, it's been very anecdotal about whether or not these things within Mormonism are effective, whether or not people can actually successfully change, whether or not it's damaging, what are the success rates if people do succeed. And too often, people, there'll be one or two people, one or two persons who sort of are willing to stand up and say, hey, I changed, I was able to change. And they'll be the ones that are brought before a large conference, and they'll be the ones that will tell everybody else, hey, you can change too. Now, we're not here to say that an individual has never been able to change. But what we do want to do is try and help people make decisions based on information and data instead of on anecdotes or selected stories that could give people maybe an impression that change is more possible and less risky than it might actually be. Does that make sense? And so that was what we were hoping to do. So I wanted to start by just talking a little bit about the survey. The research in sexual orientation change efforts is quite interesting. There haven't been an incredibly large number of scientific studies on sexual orientation change efforts in the past 10, 20, 30 years. Those that have been conducted oftentimes are just case studies or very small studies with very few numbers of participants. And then the ones that have tried to get beyond 4 or 5 or 10 participants, let's say 100 participants, oftentimes the way that they recruited for their study was to go to sources that aren't very randomly selected, which is a very important thing in scientific research, to draw from random samples. And so instead, just one second. So instead of trying to do a very randomly selected sample, one very prominent study went to all the ex-gay ministries, that the researcher could find. So, church organizations primarily, whose goal was to encourage and promote people to change. And they would go to the leaders of the ex-gay ministries and say, can you send me people to be a part of my study? And so, of course, you can think about if that pastor or that advocate for that ex-gay ministry is going to be providing people for a study, they might be inclined to provide people who have stuck around or who they know have been successful. And so you may not get a very randomly selected sample to then try and do your analysis. And so the samples have been very problematic in terms of their selection and in terms of their size. And so we worked very hard. Oh, did you have a comment?
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we basically had, we administered the survey online through a website, and we used a few methods to distribute it. The first was, I had a friend who was a newspaper reporter for the Associated Press. And so I told her about the study. She was very excited about it. And so she wrote an article for the Associated Press, which was distributed to about 250 newspapers across the world, actually, either in print or online. And so 22% of our sample comes from either print or digital media, which I think is really significant because just that percentage, you know, the total number we got was 1,600, a little over 1,600, which is a really large number for a sample like this. But 22% of that number, so what is that, 300? We can say come from a you know, a reasonably random sort of source. And I'm quite proud of that. In addition, we went to every LGBT support community within Mormonism that we could find. So Evergreen, North Star, Affirmation. There's about 20 that we approached. We had them send out the survey to their listservs. We made extra attempts to go to the conservative support groups that actually were advocates for reparative therapy. We actually made 3 personal phone calls to the head of Evergreen, begging and pleading for them to find all the participants that they could that would claim that they were able to change. We want you in our survey. So we bent over backwards to actually be inclusive in the other direction. And 22% of our sample came from those types of support groups. 11% came from blogs, websites, and internet forums. Another 39% came through word of mouth, Facebook, and email. I believe we call that snowball sampling in social science research. So basically, a very large sample, and as representative of a sample as I think could be reasonably expected without millions of dollars of federal funding. That's kind of my. In terms of biological sex, this was a little bit surprising. 76% of our sample were males, and 24 were female. I don't believe that this represents sort of what we know about the overall population in terms of distribution of same-sex attraction. So it's skewed heavily towards men. We don't fully understand why that is, but we also know that in the Mormon LGBT support groups, they are also predominantly male as well. So for some reason, females within the LDS population who experience same-sex attraction appear to be less likely or desirous to talk about it or to identify in that way. Largely white, so our sample is 91% white, 5% multiracial, 2% Latino. I won't, you know, this is just income. I'll just say that it skews a little bit more towards the more affluent side than we are anticipating the average population is. So a little bit more affluent than average, and definitely more higher levels of college education. So you know, 30% of our sample had some type of professional or graduate degree. 64% are either college graduates or above, and then 94% have had some college. So it seems to be a very highly educated group.
Smart college students.
Yeah. So one of the first area that I want to talk to you about was sexual identity development, and this was very interesting. The mean number of years that it took for people to begin to sense a difference in themselves versus others, the mean age was 9.6 years. So by the age 10, the average participant in our sample just had a feeling that they were different from everybody else amongst their peers. The mean age of realizing that they had same-sex attraction was age 14. The first same-sex romantic or sexual experience was on average at age 19, which is interesting because LDS males serve their mission at age 19. So I'm not saying what happened before or after or during, I don't know. That just seems to be a very interesting age, given 75% of our samples male to be having their first same-sex romantic experience. I'm not trying to say that they're having that on their missions, but it's an interesting age. I mean, we don't even, well, I'll go to that age. 22.5 years is the average for when they first told someone about their same-sex attraction. I don't know what that is in a non-LDS sample, but getting off your mission, you're 21, takes you a year to start dating, and then all of a sudden you realize the dating sort of isn't going so well. That age kind of makes sense. That's a theory. And then 24 years is when they first label themselves as gay or lesbian or bisexual.
And just as a side note, those ages are older than in the general LGBT population, and especially the age of first disclosure is getting lower and lower, but But now the age of first disclosure on average is 16.
Wow.
Yeah. I tried to this survey was both quantitative, which means we asked kind of numbers kind of stuff, and it was also qualitative, where we asked people to write about their experiences. So I've tried to sprinkle in some qualitative responses into the data, just to show how early people are experiencing and what they're experiencing at such a young age. I was watching a Sesame Street, and there was two guys hugging. I got an erection from watching the two men hug, and wanted a romantic relationship with another man. So I mean, just try and put yourself in this mindset of you're watching Sesame Street and you're starting to experience same-sex attraction. I had a crush on my 5th grade male teacher. So this is 5th grade. Sleeping over at a friend's house, wanting greater than normal physical contact with her, checking her out when she was changing, feeling very tense when we had to share a bed. Now, maybe some of you think that's funny or interesting, but imagine what a little kid is feeling. It's probably not a very fun thing necessarily to be feeling, worrying about what is this, what's going to happen, what are the risks, why am I feeling this way. It might be an awful experience for some. I first realized I was attracted romantically and sexually to other women when I was 12. I had a close friend who I spent a lot of time with growing up, and can remember wishing she would kiss me or sleep in the same bed with me. At first I thought it was silly, but realized after a few months that it was because I had a crush on her. In terms of how people identify, 63% of our sample identified as gay, 14% is bisexual, 14% is lesbian, 6% is heterosexual. Interestingly enough, if I recall correctly, have you guys heard of the Kinsey scale? So for those who haven't, the Kinsey scale goes from 0 to 6. 0 means you have no attraction for the same sex. You're exclusively heterosexual or attracted to the opposite sex, so that's a 0. 6 means you're exclusively attracted to the same sex, right? And then 3 is viewed as bisexual, right in the middle, right? And the mean Kinsey scores for people who identified as heterosexual was 2.1 in our sample, if my memory serves me correctly. So we have people who are very close to bisexual who are still identifying as heterosexual,
Right.
which may indicate the amount of social pressure that some people are experiencing. It could be, except that the number of transgender participants in our study was relatively small. So I talked to you about Kinsey scores. One of the deficiencies in the literature in past studies of same-sex attraction is they only ask the Kinsey scores for attraction. And that is only one dimension of people's experience within this realm. In addition to what their feelings are, there's also what their behavior is, right? Because someone may be same-sex attracted, but act in exclusively heterosexual ways, as an example. So sexual behavior is something we asked about, and then sexual identity. Someone may be a 6 on the Kinsey scale, but when they talk to somebody, they may say, I'm heterosexual, right? So they may be a 6 in attraction, but a 0 in identity, depending on how they're living. So just to give you the mean scores, the mean Kinsey score for sexual attraction was 4.9. So definitely skewing towards the 6 end or exclusively same-sex attracted. For sexual behavior, it was 4.3. So we can see that less people are acting on their same-sex attraction than are feeling it. And then sexual identity is 4.73. So those are just the basic Kinsey numbers. The relationship section, I think, is really interesting. First one is disclosure. So how out are people to their friends and family within this sample? So green represents I'm out to everybody, right? And red represents I'm completely in the closet. And then orange and yellow and light green sort of show you shades of disclosure.
So it's good to see there's a lot of green on it.
Well, yeah. So about half of our sample, a little bit over half, are pretty much out to everyone in their immediate family, but about half are still closeted to most of their family. So that's something interesting. So within the LDS population, about half of the same-sex attracted people potentially are still in the closet to their family. With friends, you'll see what you'll see is the red and orange growing, red, orange, and yellow growing as you go down.
Yeah, question.
So as you get to friends,
Is this scale built on just the LDS, like people in the LDS?
yeah, yep, Mormons and former Mormons, Mormons and former Mormons. So you can see that people are less out to their, a little bit, about the same out to their friends as immediate family, but then they're less out to their classmates and coworkers, and even less out to people at church. And so what this means is about a 40% of your LGBT family members and friends in church, if you're Mormon, about 40% of your family members or friends have not come out to you yet, right? So you only know 60% of your LGBT friends and family if you're Mormon. If these numbers hold true to a large population. Yeah. Not necessarily. Or atheist and agnostic. We'll talk about the religious distribution at the end, but this has ever been Mormon or is currently Mormon, so it's all over the board. And then in church, if you're LDS and you go to church, 70% of the gays and lesbians and bisexuals in your church have not come out yet. So you know about a third. If there are any gays and lesbians out in your ward at all, you only know about a third. A couple anecdotes. I've only come out to a select few close friends, most of who are GLBTQ identifying, and my mother and stepfather. My mother prefers not to discuss the issue at all, but we have a wonderful relationship and are very close. Because I know that my biological father and siblings would not understand my GLBTQ issues because of bigotry and prejudice against GLBTQ persons, so I do not tell them even though they are not actively LDS. My extended family are largely LDS, and that is why I don't tell them because of their religious prejudices and misunderstandings. Now I don't present this to sort of say that all LDS people are bigoted. This was just this one person's experience. I know that they're very tolerant LDS church members, and many of them are here today. In terms of relationship status, 42% of our sample is single. Remember that number because we're going to talk about the quality of life of single members of our sample in a little while. 35% are in committed same-sex relationships. 16% are in married heterosexual relationships. We're going to talk about that number in a second too. So 16% of our sample currently, it's actually 30% who engaged in a mixed orientation marriage at some point. So 1/3 of our sample, in spite of being same-sex attracted, went ahead and married heterosexually anyway. 4% are divorced and 3% other. So 31% of our sample, as I mentioned, were in a mixed orientation marriage at some point. Now, has anyone ever heard of the name Josh Weed? Okay. So I actually know Josh a little bit. This is a gentleman who is a therapist, actually, lives in the state of Washington. He's married to a woman, and they have 3 children. And I think he's a good guy. But he recently came out on his blog and said, hey, I've been married 10 years to a woman. We have the better sex life than most of the heterosexuals I know, and we're super happy. And he's also very careful to say that doesn't mean that I encourage other people to do it, but it really works for me. And I don't think anybody responsible that I know condemns Josh Weed for sharing his story or denies that that is a possibility. What we wanted to help people understand is what the risks are or the probabilities of success for engaging in a mixed orientation marriage if you are same-sex attracted, just so that you can know the odds. And if you're a parent, you might use these data to decide whether or not you're going to take Josh Weed's story and email it on to your same-sex attracted child and say, hey, Josh can do it, you ought to consider it too. And what the numbers show is that 13% of our sample is still in a mixed orientation marriage. And so what that tells you is that 57% of these marriages have already failed, right? Now, the duration of the marriages that are still intact is 16.7 years. So for those marriages that have lasted, the 40 what percent? So for the 43% of the marriages that have lasted, right, they have a mean of 16.7 years. So it's important to understand that those marriages aren't over yet. And my theory is that there's going to be kind of a bimodal kind of distribution of divorce. You either kind of get divorced early, or what? You wait until what? Kids are gone. And then sometimes there's kind of another wave. So I don't want you to think that 60% is the max divorce rate for a mixed orientation marriage. I think if we were to do a follow-up, survey of our sample in 20 years, we'd probably, we might see that number jump to 70, 75%. So what I'm trying to say is, it appears as though the divorce rates, the success rates for mixed orientation marriages are low. We know in the broad population that the divorce rate for first marriages is 40%, right? So 50% of marriages end in divorce, but only 40% of first marriages end in divorce. And so we're already at 50% worse than the national average, and it could get worse. So again, I'm not trying to like scare people, but it's important for people to know, to base their decisions on data, and this appears to be what the data are telling us. And so that's important. The average length of a mixed orientation marriage that ends in divorce is about 14 years. So even Josh Weed is into his marriage 10 years. So he's not even at yet the point where most mixed orientation marriages appear to fail, or at least the midpoint. Now this is also very interesting. What we did is we asked the Kinsey score of the people who are still in a mixed orientation marriage now, so it's that 15, 16%, versus the Kinsey score of everybody else. So that includes both people who never entered into a mixed orientation marriage and those whose mixed orientation marriages failed. And what we found is that the average Kinsey score for attraction for the people who are still in mixed orientation marriage is 3.75, which is a little bit, it's pretty much bisexual. And then 5.1 for everybody else, which is almost, getting close to the exclusively homosexual end. So my point there is, it might be, and we can't, by the t-test that we did, we can't establish directionality or causality or anything like that. But it might be that those who are able to make a mixed orientation marriage work, and this would make sense, are the ones who are actually bisexual versus the ones who are more exclusively same-sex attracted. And that's why, again, you want to be careful holding up someone as an example, because that person who was able to make it work may very well be bisexual, and your child or loved one that you may be kind of encouraging to consider that route may be more towards the 5 or 6 end of the scale on the Kinsey scale. Okay, so this is kind of interesting and a little bit controversial. So, but not intentionally controversial. It's a little bit kind of shocking and a little bit harsh. So we didn't want to just measure for things like depression and anxiety, because that's kind of just negative. It just assumes that the only thing associated with same-sex attraction is sadness and misery, which is obviously not true. So we decided to distribute something called a quality of life measure, which would basically say, how happy are you, right? How good is your life? And ask you questions like, how much do you exercise? Do you have a drinking problem? And do you have a lot of friends? And are you happy? And do you enjoy your job? And just basic happiness questions. I haven't been able to find sort of a scale to interpret the scores exactly. All the study provided were examples of medical conditions and the average score for people who have the medical condition. So the healthy average in the quality of life scale is right at 90. And then people with osteoarthritis, which I think is just kind of arthritis in the joints, is around, we'll say 87. And then lupus is around 84. And rheumatoid arthritis is around 83. And psoriasis and urinary incontinence is around 82 or 3. And then fibromyalgia, which I wouldn't have thought as being more severe than these other things, so I'm going to need help on that one, is around 70. And then the most extreme case they gave was Israeli patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they come in at around 62. Okay? So again, I didn't pick these, cherry pick these. these were, in the empirically validated measure that we used, these were the examples they gave to help us interpret this quality of life. So what we thought we'd do is we take relationship status. So single and same-sex attracted, divorced and same-sex attracted, same-sex attracted in a committed relationship but not legally married, and then legally married in a same-sex attracted relationship, and just see where they fell in terms of quality of life. It was kind of a stab in the dark, right? Because you know, didn't know what was going to happen. So the blue represents the ones I just showed you, and then the colored ones represent the various statuses. So I'll start from the very right. Single, being single and same-sex attracted in our study, was actually represented people with the poorest quality of life, somewhere between fibromyalgia and psoriasis. It's in the 70s, and I haven't spent enough time with talking with single people who are Mormons who experience same-sex attraction to understand if it's true why being single appears to be so awful. But that's what the data show. A step up from that are mixed orientation marriages, right? So again, being in a mixed orientation marriage and Mormon and same-sex attracted is somewhere between fibromyalgia and psoriasis and urinary incontinence in terms of quality of life. You go up from there is divorced and separated, and then you go up from there, it's unmarried but in a committed other sex partner. Then you go up a little more and it's committed to same-sex partner. And check this out. Same-sex married individuals who are legally same-sex married are actually healthier than the national average for this sample.
Wow, that's awesome.
And the p-value, for those of you who do statistics, the p-value of the difference between same-sex marriage and mixed orientation marriage is less than 0.01. So it's statistically highly significant, that difference, if I understand statistics correctly. And so, you know, that's interesting because if we as I'll just say LDS people, if we oppose gay marriage, right? And if we tell our same-sex attracted sons and daughters, don't be gay or lesbian because the lifestyle is so dangerous. Look how unhappy these people are, right? Because we're pointing at a certain subsegment of the population and trying to use them as a cautionary tale. Yet at the same time, we're not allowing them to get married legally, which may be their best shot at the optimal quality of life. We're simultaneously, potentially, keeping them from the happiness and the full quality of life they might be able to enjoy, and holding them up as a cautionary tale of a dangerous, unhealthy lifestyle. And so, for me, this has very important implications to say that maybe there's significant quality of life benefits to allowing full legalized gay marriage in terms of, you know, if your goal is to allow everyone to have the best quality of life as possible. Now, I'm probably taking lots of stretches when I say these things, but
No, you're not.
so I used the buzzword lifestyle in quotes because I know that that's a very controversial and charged term. But I do that, you know, we do that intentionally just because I'm hopeful that these data can dispel maybe a few myths that I believe are somewhat common within sort of the LDS populations that I've run in. 51% of our sample are in committed relationships, which I think is significant. What's also significant to me is that 50% are sexually active in their committed relationships, and 18% are celibate due to lack of partner, and 14% are celibate by choice. So only 18% of our sample are sexually active, not in a committed relationship. And so, for those who would want to say the gay lifestyle, and it's, you know, there are people who might say they're very promiscuous. That's not what the data seem to necessarily show. It seems to be that people prefer committed relationships. With the quality of life ratings, you could probably understand why they would prefer committed relationships. And by and large, people are either choosing to be sexually active in a committed relationship or celibate, with a pretty significant minority choosing to be sexually active simultaneously with multiple partners. Yes? I want to opine, but I don't have the data to answer that question. But those are good theories. So I'm not going to jump out on a limb and guess. But I haven't done that analysis yet, but that's a great idea. Other questions? Okay. So again, 18% are sexually active outside of committed relationships. Okay, so now we get into the main purpose of this study. How are we doing on time?
I'd say we're good.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about their efforts to change their sexual orientation. You're not going to be able to read this, but these are the various methods that people use to try and change their sexual orientation in descending order of frequency. So 76% of the number one method used to try and change your sexual orientation is personal righteousness within our sample. That means prayer, fasting, scripture study, temple attendance, serving in callings, sometimes multiple callings. It is heartbreaking to see how incredibly committed and devout many of the people in our sample are in terms of their very heroic and courageous efforts to be extra righteous to make this go away. And sometimes they go to age 30 and 40 still trying to pray and fast and plead to do everything they can to make it go away. And that's the number one method. Other is sort of just a general bucket that we gave people, so I'm not going to talk into that. I haven't even analyzed what other really means yet. The number two method for trying to change your sexual orientation is church counseling. Go into your bishop and stake president. Okay? About 50% do that. Then it drops from there. Psychotherapy is at 35%, support groups at 14%, group therapy at 12%, group retreats at 6%, family therapy at 3%, psychiatry at 3%, and then other efforts at 3%. Okay, now this is really important. Okay? This represents how effective, which is green, not effective, which is yellow, or harmful, which is red, these various efforts were. Okay? And they're ranked in terms of most effective to least effective. Okay? So by far, and this is people's self-ratings now. Now we have to be honest. We didn't do a pre and a post where we randomly selected people in a sample and then administered randomly these different methods of change, and then afterwards measured which ones were the most and least effective. Would True approve that? Would that pass the IRB?
I don't know, ask.
That's right, and I'm going to actually talk about when they said effective, what they meant. But psychiatry was overwhelmingly the most effective at 75%. Then other efforts at 67%, support groups at 67%, group treats at 66%, psychotherapy at 63%, group therapy at 55%, family therapy at 54%. I think it's interesting that so many of these involve multiple people. It's groups, it's family. I think that's interesting, something we need to study about why it is, and my theory is that having lots of people to talk to helps give you ideas, helps give you inspiration, helps you brainstorm, helps you vent, helps you not feel alone, gives you some social support. But groups appear to be very effective, as is medication. My guess is that the medication has to do with treating depression and anxiety. That's my guess. I think there's good support for that. But notice there's only two areas where actually the red is bigger than the green, and the red and the yellow pretty much dwarf the green, right? And which one of those? Personal righteousness and church counseling. Now, do you remember this slide before? Remember that slide?
Yes. Oh, wow.
So what's the takeaway?
Damaging.
So what we wanted to show was, okay, well, let's contrast how frequent the methods are used with how harmful or damaging they are, and see what's the takeaway. Yeah, so the average duration for using psychiatry is 7 years. Support groups is 4, group retreats is 3, psychotherapy is 4.5, group therapy is 2.7, family therapy is 4. Check this out. Personal righteousness, 11 years. And church counseling is 6.6 years.
AKA not working.
Yeah, so if you contrast, green means how effective they are, and blue means how frequently they're being used, right? So these are the most effective methods, and this is how frequently they're being used. So we see that the most effective methods are the least used, and the least effective methods are the ones that are most used. And if you do it by damage, you'll see the same thing. You'll see that the most damaging methods are often the ones that are most used, right? And so the point is that these people are using the most damaging methods to try and change for the longest duration. And then the methods that are actually most effective and least harmful, they're almost not using at all. And I think that's an important finding. Some qualitative. I attempted to change myself through righteousness behaviors. However, when the attractions remained, despite how often I prayed, read scripture, served others, attended church meetings, or was obedient, I became more depressed and felt more distant from God and others. See, it's challenging enough, apparently, to deal with same-sex attraction within an LDS context or Mormon context, or any context, frankly. But how would it be for those of you who cherish your relationship with the divine, right? How would it be to now not only have to struggle with the familial and social and personal implications of being same-sex attracted, but now have your relationship with God potentially compromised because you've done everything you could physically, possibly, spiritually, mentally, emotionally do for 10 plus years to try and change through ultra obedience, and you don't get the results you were promised by your bishop or your parents or that priesthood blessing. When that happens, you now not only have to deal with the same-sex attraction, but also your beliefs and your worldview religiously collapsing around you as well. Another one said, I was waiting for him, with the capital H, to fix me. When I realized that it wasn't going to go away, I lost trust in him and felt like he didn't love me because he wouldn't make me right.
Wow.
By living righteously in my view, my depression left. Okay, so those were kind of more sad examples. Here's one that's a little bit more neutral. By living righteously in my view, my depression left. My desire to change same-sex attraction became acceptance to it as I learned more about it. So sometimes you would find people who said, working with God actually was helpful, but usually what you see is a switch in goal. The original goal is to change, and when things become effective, it's when sort of the goal changes from change to acceptance as kind of the primary motivation of the intervention. And that's a theme that's undoubtedly throughout. Now, we asked very explicitly 4 questions about sexual orientation change. We asked about aversion therapy, which is where you actually go and they will, in the past, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they would actually hook you up to electrodes and show you pictures of, let's just say, gay pornography, and then they would shock your body parts to help develop aversions towards the same sex, so that you might, be prompted to become more attracted in the opposite sex. That is overwhelmingly harmful, right? So for the 119 people who engaged in that type of therapy, overwhelmingly it's damaging and overwhelmingly minimally effective. Therapists work with me to try to change my same-sex attraction. So this is the closest we got to actually saying, for those of you who tried to change your same-sex attraction with a therapist, how did it go? And the answer is 37% found it harmful to try and change their sexual orientation, right? But if you add in the people who said it was ineffective, it was a full 80% who said trying to change your sexual orientation through a therapist was either ineffective or damaging. And if you remember that they spent 5, 6, 8, 10 years, some people 30, working with the therapist to try and change, how much time and money do you spend visiting a therapist? I would classify ineffective as damaging as well if you factor in the time and effort that was spent trying to change that didn't help you reach the result that you wanted. Now, the flip side, we asked, if you worked with a therapist to help you accept your same-sex attraction, how did that go? And all of a sudden, boom, effectiveness shot up all the way to 86%. So if you are trying to cope with or accept your same-sex attraction, and you can find a therapist that will do sort of affirmative therapy with you, with the goal of helping you accept, people rate that as highly effective or successful. And then the most effective at all, of all the four modalities, is a therapist that's simply open and supportive of whatever the decision of the person is. And that's how I've been trained as a therapist. Your goal isn't to tell them to come out as gay. Your goal isn't to tell them they need to go back into the closet and be religious. Your goal is just to say, what are your values, what works for you, and I'm here to guide you through whatever you do, you feel is right. And that apparently is the most effective. We actually tried to measure what percent of those who attempted to change their sexual orientation through either psychotherapy, personal righteousness, or individual effort, how many of them actually experienced change? Now this is a different question than effective, and this is something Amy was asking before. Effective, there were 20% who actually said that their attempts to change were moderately or highly effective, right? But it turns out that that doesn't mean they were effective at changing their sexual orientation. It turns out that just being able to talk to someone about it, to be able to process it, to be able to share your feelings. Some people, the therapist was the first person they ever came out to. Even if that experience didn't lead to change, there are people who will still rate the experience as positive for them because of what they were able to share and just the ability to talk and brainstorm and get ideas with somebody else, even if the change part didn't work out. But when we culled our qualitative responses to try and find any indication of actual change in same-sex attraction, we found that 3.6% indicated that they saw some, decrease in their same-sex attraction and or increase in other sex attraction, right? 3.6%. Now that's an interesting number because if you contrast it with the 36% number of the people who actually experience harm in their attempt to change their same-sex attraction, what that means is you're 10 times more likely, if your goal is to change and you're going to therapy, you're potentially 10 times more likely to experience harm than you are to achieve your goal of changing. Now, if that were a drug and the FDA was looking to approve it, would you approve a drug where you were 10 times more likely to experience damage than the actual goal that you had when you wanted to take the medication? And so we thought that number was significant. And this, in terms of people's qualitative experiences, again, very mixed feelings, although through the process I've accepted my SSA more, I hoped for change and a decrease in sexual attraction to other men. That didn't happen. When people did experience change, it was things like my same-sex attraction diminished, or it dramatically diminished, or I have felt more strength from God to control myself. So when they say they did have a successful experience, sometimes they just mean their same-sex behavior decreased, or their self-acceptance, or their same-sex attraction decreased a little bit, or some. But it was almost never, it went away completely. So that's a number we're not quite ready to publish. But we actually have not yet been able to find anyone in the 1,600 plus that we surveyed who said that it went away. And that's actually been confirmed by Exodus International, which was one of the largest repair therapy groups in the nation. That their president, as I understand it, came out within the past year or two and actually said, we've actually experienced very few, if any, people who have been through our programs that actually eliminated their same-sex attraction. So the reparative therapy groups are actually owning up to this number or a number close to it. And the Robert Spitzer study, which was heavily leaned upon, which was used to show that sexual orientation change was sometimes very successful. Robert Spitzer, sort of on his deathbed, has now denounced his own study and said, the truth is, I'm embarrassed I ever published it. It was not really peer-reviewed as other studies usually are. And he's even denounced his own study, which really was the main study that reparative therapists used to advocate for reparative therapy. So in terms of support, you guys have been very patient. I hope you're not bored. Thanks for your patience so far. This represents how supportive their upbringing was and their environment is today in terms of their same-sex attraction. So again, red and orange and yellow is not so good. Green is pretty good. How supportive was it to grow up in your family as someone who is LGBTQ? Lots of red and orange and yellow, not very supportive. How open and supportive are your parents and family towards sexual and gender diversity in general? Okay, it's a little better, you know. A little less than half are in some ways open or supportive, but over half are either, you know, very unsupportive or not very supportive or neutral. How supportive is or was it to grow up in your community? So again, communities that people grew up in were not very supportive. But this is kind of the good news, I think. How open is your neighborhood community towards diversity, especially sexual and gender diversity now, right? So we can see lots more green for people describing their communities today relative to their upbringing. And then how open supportive is your school or work environment towards LGBTQ issues? And it looks like schools and work environments are becoming very friendly and hospitable towards LGBTQ individuals. And so that's good. I mean, those of us who work or go to school spend 8, 12 hours a day at work or school, and it looks like the environment's pretty good there. This study sort of ends talking about religiosity, and this is also kind of interesting. 100% of our sample was baptized in the LDS church. 63%, almost 64% were endowed in the temple. And that's a pretty significant milestone for members of the LDS church. 53% served missions. You know, 75% of our sample is male, so that's probably affecting that number. And then 10% served in bishoprics. I thought that's interesting. I don't think 1 in 10 members of a ward, a typical average LDS ward, has served in bishoprics. But 10% of our, 11% of our male population has served in bishoprics, 1 out of 10. So what happens to your religious beliefs when you're Mormon and you're same-sex attracted? 90% believed in God before they acknowledged their same-sex attraction. 70% believe in God after acknowledging their same-sex attraction. 85% believe in Jesus before acknowledging their same-sex attraction. 50% believe in Jesus after acknowledging their same-sex attraction. 78% believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God and the Book of Mormon is scripture before, so it's 78%. Drops down to 36% after acknowledging their same-sex attraction. So something about being same-sex attracted within the LDS experience leads to a significant decrease in religious belief, at least in terms of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, and it even affects belief in God and Jesus. As far as activity rates, only 30% of our sample remains active in the LDS church. So 70% of same-sex attracted Mormons, if our study holds true to the large population, 70% leave the church, 30% stay. Which is another interesting factor if you're thinking about a mixed orientation marriage. Because why would people consider a mixed orientation marriage, especially if they're a 6 or a 5 on the Kinsey scale? It's because of their religious beliefs. But if you have a 70% chance of ending up out of the church, is that a safe foundation upon which to build your marriage? It's an important question to consider as you're considering that type of thing. 36% identify as being inactive from the church. 25%, so a quarter, have resigned their church membership. 7% are excommunicated. My understanding is the church is excommunicating people less and less for same-sex attracted behavior. which I think
Or
is
a lot of
probably
individuals
positive.
just take their names off them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's the
So they don't
resign.
get
That's
excommunicated. Yeah.
That's the resigning. This is one of my favorite parts of the study. I want to do a paper just on this for nailing. Oh, shit. We'll be doing a paper. 47% of our sample, when asked if they received a spiritual experience or manifestation from God, accepting their same-sex attraction, 50% basically said, yes, God has actually visited me and told me in some form or another, I love you and I accept you just as you are. And these are some of the most touching parts of the whole sample. So for example, quote, I've had that testimony type feeling with my relationship with my Father in heaven, knowing that I am okay and that I am loved for who He made me to be. Another said, I was on the verge of suicide, driving out to the West Desert to commit the act, when I heard a still small voice that I was loved no matter what, and that nothing was wrong with me. Prayer in the temple and a distinct voice telling me in the temple I was made this way, and the only disappointment was that I wouldn't love myself for who I was. That's what God was disappointed with. And we have literally hundreds of stories just like 60% received a spiritual experience or manifestation of God's condemnation of their same-sex attraction. I'm guessing that that's not a very pleasant experience. Some people had both. Some people indicated both condemnation from Heavenly Father and love and acceptance of Heavenly Father. Most of the people who are in the 16% have since interpreted that spiritual manifestation as not being from God. But they said at the time when they were still believers and they felt those feelings that they attributed with God. Here's one example of someone who, as they're writing this, still believed that that condemnation was from God. They wrote, I have felt warned that homosexuality is a dangerous possibility that can lead me from God. But I believe He allowed me to enter this mortal body with its natural deviations, and if I keep His commandments to the best of my ability, the atonement of Christ will make up the difference. There will be a place for me in the eternities, even without another half. It's part of my eternal identity and purpose. I feel that God may be displeased with me because of guidance I received in my patriarchal blessing and teachings of members of the church, bishops, apostles, and general members. I am not sure if it is a spiritual experience, but a cultural norm that I feel condemns me. Finally, we asked people what their feelings were towards the church. 55% indicated sorrowful, and these aren't mutually exclusive. They could have checked any of these boxes. 55% said sorrowful, 44% said mistrusting, 38% said hurt or damaged, 29% said disappointed, 25% neutral, 22% committed and supportive, and then 20% are angry and hostile. And then finally, what church people attend when they attend church. 50% still attend the LDS church when they attend it. 27% attend none. 8% are agnostic, and 7% are atheists. So if you combine those numbers, 42% don't attend any church or atheists or agnostics. It's pretty devastating. For those of you who value religious belief, regardless of how you feel about same-sex attraction, and I believe that the psychology literature has demonstrated significant protective benefits, psychologically healthy benefits to being associated with the religious faith. If you care about God and religion or Christ or whatever your religious denomination has to be, if you want people to be engaged in spiritual or religious sort of endeavors, these numbers should make you feel sorrowful. Those of you who are totally happy and fine with atheism and agnosticism, you may be sad about these numbers, right? And that's okay too. Some of it's all a matter of perspective. So I probably need to figure out a way to not end this presentation on a down note. So note to self, next time I'm going to have some inspirational, hopeful end. But for now, what I'm going to leave you with is the URL where you can actually download a newsletter that we created that has some of the basic facts that you read about today, so you can share it with friends and family. And also, we can put these PowerPoint presentations up, and you can download them and reference them if you want, and look at them elsewhere. I feel bad that I've talked the whole time.
No,
There's a
I
half hour
agree.
left.
I mean, so far.
You did great.
I think we should open it for questions.
Yeah, for sure. So that's my presentation. Now let's have questions.